Welcome back to another JavaScript API tutorial. So in today's video, we are going to be covering pivot tables. So pivot tables, it will be a multi-part series just because there's a lot we can do with it. And naturally, once you kind of start going in that particular object, you'll see that there's all these kind of different ways you can do all sorts of different things. So in today's video, what we're going to be doing is seeing how to create a pivot table and then do things like add some rows to it, add maybe some columns to it, things along that nature. And then we'll also talk about some aggregation that we can do as well. So again, the idea behind this is give us at least a bare bones, mechanism in order to kind of build pivot tables. I already have some code that actually is here. So I took this from the example that actually comes with the Script Lab add-in. So if you go over here and you go to samples and you go down a little bit, you're going to see some examples that are related to pivot tables. If I can find them, I know they're here. I just saw them. At least I thought they were there. I hope they didn't get rid of them. Oh my God, did they get rid of them? No. Hold on. Hold on. Well, that's kind of scary. No, they have to be here. I literally just looked at it yesterday. If they're not here, that is the scariest thing on the planet that they just got rid of the samples like that. I thought they were here. Text box, shapes, hyperlinks, copy and paste. Oh, pivot tables. There they are. I was like, where are they? I know they're here. Anywho, so there are some pivot table examples, and I use the create and modify one. So a lot of the code that we're going to cover in this video, it's going to look pretty much identical to this one. I'm just kind of either in some cases expanding on a particular topic or showing you how to do a particular step in a different way. So again, hopefully that adds to the variety of examples that you kind of have access to. And then that way, if you come across different types of topics, you're not completely lost on how to do it. So the first thing that we do is they have a nice little function that will basically set up our little workbook so that way we can easily create a pivot table. All it really does is it creates a new worksheet called data. It first checks to see if it's even there, and if it is there, to make sure to delete that object. And so that's where you see get item or null object, because if it's not there, it's going to return a null object. And when that happens, if you don't know how to handle it correctly, it will give you an error. So what this nice little function will do is even if it returns a null object, it will still call the delete method on an object that is actually returned. So it's very useful when you're trying to deal with situations where you don't really know if that object exists. And then it also adds a second worksheet called pivot. And then there is a whole array of data. It's just some farm data with some fruits, pricing, and or not pricing, crates sold and crates sold wholesale, and some classification. So this is kind of our sample data. It puts it into a range, and then it just does some formatting. And then it also makes sure to activate the pivot sheet. So basically, if you run this, so if you do setup sample, you will see that it creates these two new tabs right down here. If you go to data, it's going to look just like that. What I'm going to do in my example is I'm going to show you how to create a pivot table from an actual list table, so a list object table. And so in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go up here, and I'm going to create basically a link to one of my buttons over here, so the create pivot table. And if we look, you will see that that particular button right here, create the pivot table, can be found in this little section, and it has an ID create with names. So when I want to reference that button inside my code, I need to make sure I pass through the button ID. And so all I'm going to do is I'm going to do $, bam, string, number sign, create with names, and then I'm going to do on click, and then I'm going to do that, and then it's going to be equal, where is it? Try catch setup. So basically, I can just copy this little code here just to save some time. Perfect. All this try catch does down here is it handles if an error does come back, and it makes sure to print it over here in the console log. So really all this is doing is wrapping our particular function inside of it, so that way if something does happen, it can still continue on. However, I do need to change this. We are going to create a new function called create with names. And again, to kind of give ourselves a little bit of a head start, we will take advantage of the code that we already have just to give us a nice little framework. And I'll just delete all the extra crap that is in here that we don't really need. And then I will rename this function. I don't want it to be called setup. I want it to be called create with names, just like that. Okay, now from here, we're going to create our pivot table. In order to create a pivot table, we really kind of have to define two pieces of information. A is the data source, so where is the data coming from that you're going to be using in your pivot table. And then the second part is the worksheet that you want your pivot table to exist on. So again, two components. One is the data source, one is the location of your pivot table. Now, before I define my data source, I am going to do something extra. I'm going to actually convert this range into a list object. So if I do Control T, that's the shortcut for creating a table, I'm just going to convert this into a table. Personally, I like to always convert my Excel ranges into a table before I ever actually create a pivot table from them, just because there's a lot of advantages when it comes to calculations and just different things related to that, where we're going to kind of get a speed boost, and it's going to make adding data to this range a lot easier. And then the pivot table is going to be able to recognize changes in the data a lot easier than if it was traditional Excel range. So I always encourage people, always try to put your data in a defined table before you actually create your pivot table. So now that we've done that, let's define our worksheet. So define the data source and the pivot table location. And so we'll define two constants because they're not going to be changing. We'll call it worksheet data. That's going to equal our context environment. And we're going to go to our workbook object and then into the worksheets collection. We're going to call the get item method, and then we're going to pass through the name of our particular sheet that contains the data. In this case, the worksheet name is data. And then I am going to call this one again. And I just realized I didn't add an extra sign, which I wasn't supposed to. And I'm going to change this one to worksheet pivot. And as you guessed, it's almost identical. We're just going to change the name of the worksheet that we want to get. So we've defined our two worksheets. Now let's define the data range that we're going to be passing through into our particular pivot table. Now, I'll show you both ways, like how you would define the range and how would you define the table. So define the range of data. If you wanted to do it the traditional way, where it wasn't necessarily a list object, it would be constant data range equals the worksheet data, because that contains our data, and then it's going to be get range. In this case, it's A1 to E21. That's all fine and dandy, but personally, I like to make sure that I use a data table. So I do worksheet data. I go into my tables collection. I call the get item method. I see that my table name up here is table 1, and so I just pass through table 1. And then once with a particular list object, there is a get range method. And so you can actually call it and it will know that you are talking about the range of the table. Notice here, I don't have to actually specify the address. I just specified the table. And again, behind the scenes, Excel has defined what range is taken up by that table. So that's kind of really the advantages I think of it. And then also, if you add data to this, it will automatically let the program know, hey, your range has changed. Okay, so we've defined the data source, define the location of the the pivot table. And so from here, I'm going to, again, just create a new variable. We'll call it something like pivot range. That will equal the worksheet pivot. I'm going to get the range. And in this example, I want it to be in cell A2. So if I go to pivot sheet, it's going to be right here, A2. And then I'm going to put my little semicolon, and then I can now call my worksheet pivot. And then on that particular worksheet, there is a collection called the pivot tables collection, and it has a method called add. It takes two parameters, well, technically a little bit more, but at this point, uh, one is the name. It's going to be farm sales. The second one is going to be the source, so that is the data source. Well, in this case, I've defined it up above. That's just the data table. And then the final one is the destination. So the destination is where you want this pivot table to be. Well, again, I've already defined that to be the pivot range. I went ahead. So I should have all the components I need in order to create my pivot table. And then at the end, I'm going to call the await context sync, so that way it finishes creating the pivot table before closing the function. So if I do this, I ran it, and now we can see over here I have a pivot table. It's a blank pivot table, so there's nothing really here, but this is how you would create a pivot table using the JavaScript API. So let's just do a couple more things. In this case, we'll add some rows of data to it, and then we'll also talk about adding some aggregations, and then we'll call it quits for this video. Okay, so what's the next one? Well, we're going to have to create a new, basically an event in a sense, where if we click a button, it calls a particular function. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the ID from create with names to add rows. And so I'm going to get rid of that C at the front. And this one will, when I click it, we'll call the add row function that I'm going to define right below. Some of it will be familiar. Some of it won't. I'm going to change my function name to add row. And let's see what we need to do. Well, the nice thing is I already have some of the components that I already need. So I'm going to delete this one. However, I now need to define my pivot table. And so I'm going to create a new variable called pivot table that will equal the worksheet pivot. And again, it does have a collection called pivot tables, which if I call the get item method, I can specify the pivot table that I want to select. Now, first up here, we defined our pivot table to have a name. It's called farm sales, but you can also see it up here at the ribbon bar under pivot table names. So that is how you can select your particular pivot tables. Now, you could technically also do the index as well, but in this situation, I like the name just because usually it's a little bit more unique. Okay. So here, define the pivot table. That's kind of how I like to think about it. I'm going to delete some of this just because it's kind of junk and we don't need it at this point. Okay, so how do we think about pivot tables? Well, if you've seen my series on the VBA version of this, you will understand there's a lot of different moving components about a pivot table. So the first thing that we need to understand is there are these kind of collections, and each one of these collections are kind of contain other different components in it. Basically, at the top of our pivot table, there's something called hierarchies. And your hierarchies come in different shapes. There's a data hierarchy, there's a row hierarchy, and there is a column hierarchy. And each one of those is a different component of the pivot table. Now, the rows should be pretty obvious. That would just be going, up and down. Columns would be going left to right. And then the data would actually be the metrics that you're going to kind of have in the cross of both of those. And so in our particular example, we're going to add some rows to our pivot table. Well, that's going to fall under the row hierarchies because the row hierarchies contains all the different fields inside the rows. And if you drill down in your row hierarchies, you're going to land at a field, and a field is basically like a metric. So that might be something like the category, the farm or something like that. And if you keep digging down, then you're going to have a pivot item. So inside your field, you can have an item. So I could have under my fruit category, which is a field, I could have a kiwi as an item or a lemon as an item. So there is structure to it, but when you first start playing with it, sometimes it's a little bit confusing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to define the hierarchy we want to work with. So define the hierarchy we want to work with. And so here we'll again define another constant because it shouldn't be changing. And here it's going to be the pivot table that we're currently working with. And you will know there is something called the row hierarchies. But you also notice there's a data hierarchies. There's a filters hierarchies. There's just a hierarchies in general, which is basically everything. And there's a column hierarchies. So that's your entry point to the different sections of your pivot table. Always remember that. It is the entry point to the different sections of your pivot table. You cannot get an item if you're not in a field. You cannot get a field if you're not in a hierarchy. That's basically how you need to think about it. I want the row hierarchies. Okay, so now that I've done that, we're going to first do a couple things. So every time we do this, we need to first check if the row already exists. Because if we try to add in that row and it already exists, it's going to throw back an error. Now, if it doesn't exist, it's fine. So from here, we're going to check if the pivot table already has the rows. And so there's going to be a couple. We'll define a farm row. That will be the row hierarchy. We'll get the item or null object because, again, it's not always guaranteed it's going to be there. And so if it does return a null object, we want it to be okay and it's not going to freak things out. So that's why we do the get item or null object. And I don't know why there was a space there. Okay, and I'm just going to kind of repeat this a couple times. The next one will be type. And then the next one will be class. And then, as you guessed, this is pretty much exactly the same. One is going to be classification. Again, if you are curious, remember type, classification, and farm. So I'm basically defining the rows of my particular pivot table. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to load the objects. So load the objects before kind of going in the next spot. So we're going to do row hierarchy. We're going to do load. And from here, what we're going to do is, again, our favorite, our await context.sync. This is probably one of the more frustrating things about this particular API is constantly having to call that. Okay. So now comes the, not necessarily the hard part, but the part where we want to kind of make it dynamic. So check if it's null. And if it is, then add the row to the pivot table. The way we're going to be setting this up, it's going to almost in a sense create a drill down feature, because if we keep clicking the button, it's going to go to the next hierarchy, or sorry, the next kind of row, and it's going to check that next one, because we'll see we're going to build it in such a way where it's only checking if it's null. So if it's not null, it's just going to go to the next condition and then keep going down and down and down. Okay. So what we'll do, check if it is null, and if it is, then add it and exit the if statement. Otherwise, keep going down the if statement. Again, it'll make more sense when you see it. It's kind of hard to explain in words. Okay, so if farm row is null object, what are we going to do? Well, if it's a null object, then take that row hierarchy, add to the pivot table dot hierarchies dot get item, and then farm. So all this is going to do is it's going to add it if it's not already there. We're going to keep adding to this, else, and then if type row is null object, tab, and then again our little squirrely brackets, it's almost identical. We're just going to copy this, put it down here, But now in this case, we're going to do type. Finally, else if, in this case, it's going to be class row is null object, bracket, bam. But now in this case, classification. Okay. So what is this going to do? If it's a null object, add the row. So imagine the first one's a null object. It's going to add it, and that's it. On the second one, okay, so in that situation, well, let's just do this. Let's add the row. Okay, so now we have that. Now think about this. If I call this function again, and the first thing I'm going to ask is farm row a null object? Well, it's not, because it's already in here. So this is actually going to return something. It's not going to be null. So in this situation, this condition will not be true. So it's going to go to this next one, and it's going to ask the question, is type row a null object? Well, if it is, then add it to that particular pivot table. So that's what this one's going to now do. It's just going to add another component, and so on and so on. So now we've seen that really all it's doing is it's allowing us, in a sense, to basically drill down into our pivot table. So 1, 2, so on and so on. So pretty cool. I thought that was nice. It makes a little bit, I would call it intuitive or user-friendly. And obviously there's a lot of different things you can do with that. I mean, you might want to add 5 different things. I don't know. People get creative, I will say. I've seen some very creative things over the years where people are like, I don't know how you even thought of that, but props to you. Okay, so now that we've talked about adding rows, let's move on to the next component, which is we're going to talk about aggregation. So aggregation is where we basically take our particular metrics and we add them to our pivot table. Now, most time by default, if it's like a number, it's just going to usually do a sum, and if it's non-numeric, so something like a string, it tends to do count. And so naturally, in some cases, we might not want to do the standard one. And so we can basically dictate what kind of aggregations the JavaScript API uses by defining the aggregation itself. And so I think I already have it perfect. Yeah. I'm going to copy this, put it down here, and this one will be add ags. I don't know if that makes sense, but I thought it was neat. Ooh, goodness. I went to Nectar this morning and it was good. I like their juice. Kind of pricey, but overall it was good. And then I'm going to change this one. Okay, so this part's going to stay the same because, well, that's what it is. Now comes the fun part. This is where things, at least in my mind, it just seems like it's more work than it needs to be, but maybe it's just me. We're going to first add a data hierarchy, which is basically taking these two columns and putting them in the data portion of our particular pivot table. So it's basically recreating this aspect. It would be like putting it here. That's really all we're doing. And I'm sorry if it's kind of hard to see. I'm trying to make it where it's like this is kind of the main thing and this the second, but it's hard. I'm really hoping they kind of fix this at some point. But that's really all it's doing. It's like we're basically taking those metrics and we're putting them in the values component of our pivot table. And so in order to do that, what we're going to do is this is going to stay the same, but now we're going to work with the data hierarchies collection. So I'm going to delete this. And then I'm going to delete this. And from here, we're going to add an aggregation. So add some data hierarchies. By default, these will be sums for numeric values. Okay, so we'll call our pivot table object. We'll go to our data hierarchies. We're going to call the add method. And this particular method takes a hierarchy object. That's how you need to read this. It's a pivot hierarchy. Now, there's a lot of different hierarchies naturally. There could be, column hierarchy, whatever it is. But really, we should be just working with the hierarchy itself because we don't want to I mean, you can technically take the row and put it in the data, but really at this point, these ones, the ones that we're going to be working with, don't really have a defined hierarchy. They're kind of just existing somewhere out there, and we're now going to define which section of it is. So now that's kind of like the broad hierarchy. That's kind of how I like to think about it. But this is the part I don't like. So now I have to call my pivot table object. I got to call my hierarchies collection. I have to call the get item method. And then I have to do crates sold at farm. To me, that's a lot of typing just to do one little thing. I don't know. I always found, I mean, I guess VBA was kind of like that. And I was just doing a lot of shortcuts. But that's really kind of, I would say, the most frustrating part about this at this point is just the fact that doing little things like that is, I would say, longer than it really needs to be. But we'll see here, once I run this, it adds those two hierarchies to the pivot table. So pretty cool. I think that's nice, but we might not want the default one. So you can see here, it's just a simple sum. What if we don't want it to be a sum? What if we want it to be something else? Like, I don't know, a max or a min or just something along that nature, just not the default one. Well, we can change it, but we need to first load the items that we've currently set in there. So after that, after we basically run this little section, we're going to now have some items in our data hierarchy. And so we need to load those items before going on to the next one. So load the items we just placed in the data hierarchy. Hierarchy. Can never spell that word if my life depended on it. So pivot table, we'll go to the data hierarchies. We'll call the load method, and then we're going to load the items collection, basically. So all the items in our data hierarchy. When we call this, now we can go to the next step. So now we can redefine the aggregation. So we can calculate the max and the count. Okay, so first thing is we'll take our pivot table. We'll call the data hierarchies collection. We'll call the items collection. And in this case, I'll call the first one. That will be crates sold at farm because that was the first one we added. And once you've done that, there is something called summarize by. Now this one requires an aggregation function. So we go into our Excel object, and right up here at the top, you're going to see aggregation function. If I go next, you'll see all the different types of aggregations we can do. So there's sum, unknown, variance, standard deviation, all that stuff. Now in this example, let's do count for the first one. And I'm really going to just copy this one again because there's really no reason to kind of have it twice. That's, to me, a little bit foolish. But and then in the second one, we'll do the max. And from here, whoops, my bad. What we'll do is when you notice this, it's not going to be a sum. It's going to be a different type of aggregation. So this one is now a count, and this one is now the max. So it's saying for organics and all that stuff, you can see all the different things. So pretty cool. I thought that was kind of neat. And if you keep drilling down, it's now just going to take it right up to above. So that does it for this video. So if you have any questions about inserting a pivot table, working with the row hierarchies, or working with some aggregations, please put them down in the comments below. Obviously, there's going to be more videos on this topic. There's a lot we can do with pivot tables, and it seems like for the most part, I would say this is probably one of the more complete objects in here. There wasn't really anything that I saw that was missing from the VBA one. It seems to have everything that the VBA one has. So for the most part, it looks like pivot tables are good to go. But again, sometimes when people first look at it, they're like, wait a minute, this is very different in certain regards. As always, try to always put them down in the comments below, and I'll try to help if I can. And then also, if you could, please make sure to like the video. We always appreciate the support. And If you're not already, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so that way you get regular updates as we release new videos. Thank you again for watching, everybody. We'll see you in the next video.